everyone, this is the first in my series of long reads where I take some of my essays and I read them out to you with some of my thoughts behind why I wrote what I wrote, adding a little bits and pieces here and there depending on how the piece was received at the time and what misconceptions there were or what understanding that it generated. So these are either published in established online publications or on my blog, Systems Shape Systems, that is on Substack. So my name is Tara-Lyn and I'm a scientist and a writer. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology, but I've also studied psychology and human behavioral ecology, biological anthropology, including primatology. So I understand behavior at several different levels and often see debates and communications around human behavior that are vastly oversimplified. And so what I am hoping to do is to add nuance and complexity to these discussions without it being, let's just throw up our hands and say everything's complicated. Complicated things can be studied rigorously and we can understand what levers to pull in systems to produce maybe the interventions or the changes that we want to see. So the first one that I'm going to read you today is Trauma is Carried in Your DNA, but Science Reveals a More Complicated Story. And this was published in The Conversation. And I am using this one as my first one because this is by far my most successful essay. It was read by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. It's been translated into different languages and it generated huge media attention as well. And so what this told me is that there is a real appetite for nuanced information, especially as it comes to transgenerational effects and trauma. So I really wrote this one because I was seeing, especially posts from really big popular science communication outlets like National Geographic that ask, whether, your genes carry your family's past trauma. And the images and the posts are really, really misleading and really, really oversimplified. The articles might be better, but from what I read, not often they're not any more nuanced. But sometimes they are, but they're behind a paywall. So really all people see is this snippet of information. And then the comment sections are just littered with misconceptions one way or the other. So I decided to write this. As war continues to rage in Gaza and Ukraine, there is concern about how the related trauma might be transmitted to future generations of people in those regions. More generally, the interest in the idea of transgenerational trauma has recently surged. For example, earlier this year, National Geographic magazine asked whether genes carry past family trauma. While this might be a catchy question, it's also slightly misleading because while trauma can ripple across generations, shaped by how our bodies respond to their environments, its effects are not hard-coded in our genes. Plastic minds and bodies. At the heart of this process is what's known as phenotypic plasticity. This is the capacity for organisms to produce different outcomes from the same genes depending on their environment. These outcomes, called phenotypes, can include stress sensitivity and body shape. So one reason that I wrote about plasticity here is because usually when plasticity is communicated, the general discourse around it is about neuroplasticity. And it's about, how we can kind of change our brains and kind of change our cognitive pathways and the ways that we think about things with different practice and different habits over time. Sometimes that debate or that discussion also becomes oversimplified and not accurate. But what is often left out is that plasticity isn't just in the brain. It doesn't just apply to our neurons in the brain. It applies to so many different biological systems. And, neuroplasticity is one way that it's expressed. And so I really thought that it would behoove me to help people understand plasticity generally. So one way that different phenotypes can arise from the same genes is via epigenetics, which are small chemical changes to the DNA molecule that make particular genes more or less active. You can think about these like a director's notes on a script. The notes guide the cell on which lines to emphasize or which lines to soften without changing the script itself. But epigenetics is really only just one way that this plasticity is expressed. Understanding how trauma is passed across generations means looking beyond genes and cells to the environments that shape and influence them. Human development is sculpted by lived experience, from caregiving and community to stress, safety, and belonging. These factors interact to produce lasting but not always fixed effects. By focusing on how they interact rather than on single causes, we can better understand why trauma echoes across generations. This also helps us to identify how that cycle might be disrupted. Widespread in nature. So phenotypic plasticity is widespread in nature. In honeybees, genetically identical larvae become queens or workers depending on what they eat while developing. In three-spined stickleback fish, early exposure to predators reshapes their stress physiology, changes their body shape, making them harder for predators to grasp. These are not genetic differences. So the genetic code remains the same. And that's the key thing about plasticity. And that's the key thing about understanding these epigenetic effects, is that it changes what's expressed, but it doesn't change the code itself. In humans, early life conditions similarly shape development. A child raised in an unsafe setting may develop heightened vigilance or stress sensitivity, traits that help in danger but that can persist as anxiety or chronic stress in times of safety. And we often call this environmental mismatch. Across generations, plasticity becomes more complicated. In some of my past research, I studied how diet in one generation of fruit flies shaped the health, the reproduction, and the longevity in their offspring and grand offspring. The results varied depending on diet, generation, and the trait that I was looking at. Traits that appeared to be useful in one generation weren't always so in the next. And this highlights how difficult transgenerational effects are to predict precisely because of this plasticity. Too narrow an explanation. Epigenetics often reflect environmental exposures such as stress, trauma, nutrition, or caregiving, but they're not necessarily permanent scars. Many are dynamic and can shift with changing environments, especially in early life. Studies show that epigenetic patterns linked to early childhood adversity vary depending on later environments such as family stability and social support. And this suggests that the biological imprint of early stress is shaped by what happens next. So it's tempting to treat epigenetics as the key to explaining inherited trauma, but that is too narrow. And really, this is why I put this in, because epigenetics, from around, I guess, let's say 10-ish or more years ago, started to really have its day. We saw a lot of articles come out about new studies and a lot of science communication linked to epigenetics. And the truth about epigenetics is that it is very exciting. It's still relatively new. It's still something that we need to understand more. But the other thing about epigenetics and the truth about it is that often these effects account for such a small amount of variation. So what I'm saying here is that because our genetics are varied, our environments are varied, but even our plastic response to those environments are varied, it means that we can't always predict with certainty what the response of one person or one generation will be with one stimulus. You could give the same stimulus to a whole bunch of different people, different generations, even different animals. And, you can, even in the lab where we can control so many things about fruit flies, for example, we still see huge amounts of variation in the data. And so that's really my point here, that genes and epigenes and environments and social systems and all of these things are always constantly interacting. They're not linear. Where was I up to? I'm going on too many rants. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it's tempting to treat epigenetics as the key to explaining inherited trauma, but it's too narrow. Trauma can influence the next generation through altered hormones, immune function, or in utero conditions, all of which shape our brain development and stress reactivity. Genetic variation also plays a major role. It doesn't encode the trauma itself, but it shapes our traits such as sensitivity to threat or emotional regulation. These traits aren't anything we've chosen. They arise from a web of biological and social influences that are beyond our control. But how they unfold and whether they're amplified or softened depends on the systems that surround us. Connection to culture. Connection to culture plays an important role too. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Maori-led initiatives that centre land, language, and ancestral lineage, it's called Wakapapa. Sorry, I botched that. But ancestral lineage have shown promise in restoring well-being after generations of colonialism-related trauma. And so that's the other thing, is we have a lot of different groups of people around the world that have colonialism-related trauma. We have people that have war-related trauma. We have Holocaust survivors. And so when we have these large-scale events that affect specific groups of people, we can look to see what works for them to really understand how we can combat some of those things that we can't control. But for Holocaust survivors and descendants, connection to cultural identity through ritual and shared narrative can reduce the psychological burden of transmitted trauma. But not all trauma is collective or institutional. Interventions such as trauma-informed parenting and early relational therapies have been shown to improve outcomes in the next generation. These psychological supports affect biology. Feeling safe in our relationships, having stable routines and a sense of meaning can reduce stress-related hormones, modulate immune function, and buffer against long-term disease risk. In this way, culture, caregiving, and connection are all biological interventions. When they soften the effects of earlier stress, they may help us interrupt its transmission. Reframing inherited vulnerability. So this matters because it changes how we understand inherited vulnerability. Rather than a permanent wound passed down through DNA, the effects of trauma are better understood as changeable responses shaped by context. Thanks to plasticity, our biology is always in conversation with the environment, and when we change the context, we can change the outcome. So thanks to those sirens just right at the end. But so really what I was trying to get across here, and really where I think that my approach differs from 99% of the other essays and the other writing that is out there, especially the science communication on this, is that I have taken an interdisciplinary approach. I believe that psychology, biology, philosophy, cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, social science and the humanities, every single one of these disciplines has their own inherent ways of doing things, their own inherent biases, and their own inherent positives and negatives. They think about knowledge slightly differently. They think about evidence slightly differently. The variation within each field is huge. So we can use some of the best evidence and the best thinking that we can find in each of these disciplines and really synthesize that together. And that's what I do in my writing, and that's what I did in this essay. And that's why I think that it resonated with so many people, because whilst we do have constrained and limited agency, whilst we do have no choice in our parents and how we were born, in the privilege that we have or do not have, whilst I do not believe in the bootstrap narratives, these things need to change on a systems and societal level, not on an individual level. It does not mean that we can't try to create the context that will then change the outcome. So I hope you enjoyed my first long reads. It was a little bit, imperfect, but hopefully I'll get better at them as we go along. If you enjoyed this, please find me on Substack. I'm on Instagram. I'm everywhere really, but please find my Substack. Subscribe. I've got a lot more there for you to read. My whole entire thing is writing about how our body reacts to certain situations, which involves trauma, it involves threat detection, but it also involves how our minds try to seek control, so what our biases are, what psychology can tell us about those biases, and then how systems, our social systems and the world around us, reinforce some of those patterns of thinking, and then how we can begin to unlearn some of the things that keep us stuck, some of the things that prevent some of the things we would like to see in our society. And so this really is so relevant to policy, it's so relevant to our individual lives, but really I want to focus on what we can do collectively when we come together.